kick into it. So my name is Lauren Kerrison. I'm a work health and safety facilitator for the Tasmanian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and my role is funded by the WorkCover Board Tasmania, and that's why this session is free today. Thank you to them. And I just help Tasmanian businesses with all things work health and safety. I will be admitting people throughout this training as well, so bear with me while I just accept them. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask throughout. Just put yourself off mute or put it in the chat and I'll read it when I get between my slides. So what we will be covering is, first off, just a little bit on duty holders, what is involved in managing risks and when to use a risk management approach. We'll go through the steps 1 to 4 of a risk assessment and the hierarchy of controls, and then finish up on risk registers. We've got an hour allocated for this, but I believe it will be pretty quick, and then that will give us some time for any questions at the end. So I will be referencing the Code of Practice, How to Manage Work Health and Safety Risks. You can access this free off Safe Work Australia's website. And this is the content that we'll be going through. So it's quite high level, and even though there are a lot of different industries online, the foundation's still the same for everybody. And if you've got any specific questions, we can go through those as well. So first of all, just quickly, we will go through the duty holders. So we've got the PCBU. So that stands for a person conducting a business or undertaking. So it's the company, it's the business, or the director of those. So a PCBU must eliminate, and if they can't eliminate risk, they must minimise them in the workplace. Examples where PCBU has a duty is if the PCBU engages workers to carry out work, or PCBU directs or influences workers in carrying out the work. Other people may be put at risk from work carried out in the business or undertaking, and also the PCBU manages or controls a workplace or fixtures, fittings, or plant and equipment. So that's when their duty comes into play. You've then got officers, so such as company directors and managers. They have a duty to exercise due diligence to ensure the PCBU complies with the work health and safety regs. Now it's very wordy, but bear with me. This includes taking reasonable steps to gain an understanding of the hazards and risks associated with the operations of the business. And we'll go through that in more detail. Designers, manufacturers, importers, suppliers of plant substances or structures, they must ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, that what they are supplying is supplied without risks to health and safety, in a nutshell. And then you've got workers and others at the workplace. So workers and others have a duty to take reasonable care of their own health and safety and to not adversely affect the health and safety of others. So workers and other, they must comply with reasonable instructions and policies and procedures that the business has. And again, I'm just admitting a few more people now. So we'll go through those in more detail. So what is involved in management risk? Well, one of the most important aspects of this is management commitment. Effective risk management starts with commitment to health and safety from those who operate and manage the business or undertaking. So you also need the involvement and cooperation of your workers, supply chain partners, and all others. But management commitment is about demonstrating you are serious about health and safety and influencing the other duty holders in the workplace. So to demonstrate your commitment, you should be getting involved in health and safety issues so that you understand the risks, the hazards and risks associated with your operations. Consult workers and other duty holders on the hazards and risks and how to control those. Invest time and money in health and safety where it's reasonably practicable. Ensure you and your workers clearly understand health and safety responsibilities and have the knowledge and skills to do tasks safely. And finally, apply health and safety values and behaviours to your own work practices. So this is all a part of the management commitment piece. What is involved in managing risks? So we've got a step-by-step process. This is straight from the codes of practice, and a safe and healthy workplace does not happen by chance or guesswork. So you have to think about what could go wrong at your workplace and what the consequence could be. So then you must do whatever you can, and we always use the word reasonably practicable, to eliminate or minimise the health and safety risks arising from the business. So you can see there, number one, identify hazards. That's find out what could cause harm, basically. Then you've got two, assess risks if necessary. So understand the nature of the harm that could be caused by the hazard and how serious the harm could be and the likelihood of that happening. And we'll go through all these in more detail. The third one there, control risks. So implement the most effective control measure that is reasonably practicable in the circumstances and ensure it remains effective over time. And that's a pretty key part to this as well. And then finally, 4 is to review hazards and control measures to ensure they are working as planned. So this process will be implemented in different ways depending on the size and nature of your business. Larger businesses usually have these in sectors where workers are exposed to more or higher risks and are more likely to need a more complex, sophisticated risk management process. But regardless of that, this is what it looks like. You've got the steps 1 to 4, and this is what we'll go through in a lot of detail. You would have already heard me say this word a lot, but you need to determine what is reasonably practicable for the business. So deciding what is reasonably practicable to protect people from harm requires taking into account and weighing up all relevant matters. So that could be the likelihood of the hazard or risk concerned occurring, the degree of harm that might result from the hazard or risk, and then knowledge about the hazard or risk and ways of eliminating or minimising the risk, and then finally the availability and suitability of ways to eliminate or minimise the risk. So you've basically got to weigh up the cost and benefit. So if you've got a medium risk in the workplace, what's a reasonably practicable cost that the business would incur for that hazard? Hope that I've explained that okay, but it is used a lot, and sometimes it's a little bit easier to understand as you go through this session as well. So when do we need to use the risk management approach? These are some examples. So starting a new business, you need to do a risk management approach. Expanding or purchasing an existing business because there's some changes that are occurring. Any changes to work practices, procedures or work environment. So say you've got a machine and you've moved it from room A to room B, that would be a change. Any change in work practices, any new procedures that are either new or being changed within the workplace, this is when you would need a risk management approach. Introducing new workers to the workplace, so that one's quite simple. Purchasing new or used equipment. So whenever we're getting new or used equipment at the workplace, we need to be performing a risk management or risk assessment. Any new suppliers, commissioners or contractors. Planning to improve productivity or reduce costs, because we would probably know that sometimes if you're trying to reduce your cost, improve productivity, crunch those deadlines a little harder, there may be some impact to people's health and safety at work. People could be rushing, they could be fatigued, they could be stressed, things along those lines. And that is what needs to be considered in your risk management approach. When new information about workplace risks become available, so when the codes are updated, when some guidance materials updated, those kind of things, and responding to incidents or concerns from workers. So we should be able to take them through a risk management process so they understand the risk that they're dealing with and what controls we can put in place. So step 1. So I've circled it there. You can see number 1, identify hazards. So we do a separate training session on what a hazard is and how to perform a risk assessment as well. So this is just a high level of that. So identifying hazards in the workplace involves finding things and situations that could potentially cause harm to people. Hazards generally arise from the following aspects of the work and their interaction. So you've got physical work environment, equipment, materials and substances used, work tasks and how they are performed. So here's a really good table straight out of the codes of practice that will give you some common types of workplace hazards. Some hazards are part of the work processes, such as like mechanical hazards, noise, or toxic properties of substances, whereas other hazards result from equipment or machine failures and misuses. So this table, I think the codes has a page or two of examples if you want to check that out, but I've just got a couple of examples here. So you can see the top one, the hazard is manual tasks. An example is tasks involving sustained or awkward postures, high or sudden force, repetitive motions or vibration. And the potential harm there is musculoskeletal disorders such as damage to joints, ligaments and muscles. So I won't read all of these out, but this is a really good resource. It's in the code of practice, so you can look at some examples of hazards or common hazards in the workplace. So as a PCBU or an officer, regularly walking around the workplace and observing how things are done can help predict what could or might go wrong. So we should all be doing this. We want to inspect the workplace and look out for the following. So does the work environment enable workers to carry out work without risks to health and safety? How is work performed, including the physical, mental and emotional demands of the tasks and activities? How suitable are the tools and equipment for the tasks, and how well are they maintained? How do workers, managers and supervisors interact, and how are inappropriate behaviours or conflicts dealt with? And finally, have any changes occurred in the workplace since that may affect people's health and safety? So hazards are not always obvious. Some hazards can affect health and safety over a long period of time, such as stress, like bullying, or fatigue as well is another good example with shift work. And as you walk around, you can make a list of hazards that you find to ensure that nothing gets missed, unless it's straightforward and the action can be taken immediately. Like a good example is if, you knocked a glass on the ground and it shattered, that's a hazard. If you clean that up instantly, it's a pretty straightforward thing. You don't need to get your clipboard and write down, shattered glass on the ground, control measure, pick it up. You'd simply go and you would pick it up. Consulting with workers is really important when it comes to risk management, because workers are the ones at the end of the day that are out there physically doing this work and are physically exposed to these hazards more likely. Obviously, all the other duty holders are too. But they often have a wealth of knowledge in what they're doing. They should be able to give you recommendations on what they think could be appropriate control measure for that hazard. So they're a really good resource, and you always want to be consulting with your workers. And that way you might naturally get a little bit more buy-in from the workers, because if you've ever been told something, sometimes you're reluctant to do it. Whereas if you're involved in implementing something, you may be more likely to be on board. And then you also want to consult with supply chains and networks. It doesn't stop there. You want to be consulting with all relevant stakeholders. So it's managers, supervisors, workers, supply chains and networks, everybody that has something to do with the health and safety aspect of the risks, involved with what they're doing. So then we go into step 2. So step 1, we're identifying the hazards. Now we're on to step 2, assess the risk. So how to assess the hazard and the likelihood of this happening is basically what we're doing. So a risk assessment can help you as a PCBU or officer, as a worker or anybody, to determine the severity, the likelihood, what the likely outcomes are. This is that aspect of the risk assessment process. So it's actually assessing what the risk severity is. So how to use a risk assessment. A risk assessment should be done when, so these are some examples, there is an uncertainty about how a hazard may result in injury or illness. The work activity involves a number of different hazards, and in some circumstances, a risk assessment will assist to identify which workers are at risk, so identify the actual workers, determine what sources and processes are causing the risk, identify if and what kind of control measures should be implemented, and finally check the effectiveness of the existing controls. So this is, I've rolled too far forward there. This is when this side of the risk assessment process is needed. How to perform a risk assessment. So first of all, we want to work out how hazards may cause harm. Secondly, we want to work out how severe the harm could be, and then we need to work out the likelihood of the harm occurring. So I've got an example of this here. So here's just a generic risk matrix. If your business hasn't got one, use this one or come up with one that's relevant for your business, and I can help you do that if you like. But it's pretty critical to have a risk matrix in your business. And that way you can get your own relevant definitions for the hazards that you're dealing with, because say hazards that you're dealing with when you're working in real estate versus when you're working in construction versus when you're working in mining versus when you're doing my job are all very different. So that's why you need to cater your risk management or your risk matrix tools for that. So first of all, this is just an example, but you need to determine what the consequence could be. So you've got a hazard. If we use the example of the shattered glass on the ground, you would give it a 1 up to 5, and 5 being worst, 1 being least bad. So depending on the definitions within the business, you know, a 3, usually the moderate one, is kind of like needing some GP appointments and physio, maybe hospital to get a stitch, something along those lines. Major is usually something more serious, you know, an impactful disease or illness that's had that person off work for a certain amount of time. And catastrophic is a fatal hazard. So if we use the example of the shattered glass on the ground, if I was to clean that up, the consequence could be that I could cut myself. So we could say that maybe that's a minor to moderate consequence. Once you've determined what your consequence is, so we'll just say 3, for example, you then move on to your likelihood. So how likely is that consequence to occur? And the word reasonably practicable comes back into this, because it's got to be the most reasonable outcome. It can't be a worst case scenario. It has to be the most reasonable consequence and likelihood, okay? So if I was cleaning up glass all day as part of an 8-hour shift, that was the job that I was doing, I'm probably more likely or almost certain to going to be cutting myself on that glass. If I'm just cleaning it up once and I've got all the tools, the PPE, equipment to do so, the likelihood of that consequence to occur is probably a 1. So hopefully this is making sense to you. And as a business, you need to have 1, a risk matrix, and 2, get some definitions in your risk management procedure. So define what 1 to 5 looks like in your business in both consequence and likelihood. And again, I can send through examples if anyone wants to email me for those. So we've assessed the risk. Now we move on to step 3. So how to perform a risk assessment is we need to control risks. So the most important step in managing risks involves eliminating, firstly, but if you can't eliminate, minimising the risk so far as is reasonably practicable. So in deciding how to control risks, the PCBU must consult your workers and their representatives like HSRs or Health and Safety Committee people. Their experience will help you to choose appropriate control measures, and their involvement will increase the level of acceptance. So I've already gone through that pretty broadly, but if they're involved, they're more likely to, get on board with the control measure that you're implementing. Now, a key part to control measures are the hierarchy of controls. So again, this is straight out of the codes of practice, but you can see up the top there, the highest level of health and safety protection, and it's the most reliable. So you always start at the top. And the hierarchy of controls can be applied in any risk, and the work health and safety regulations make it mandatory for duty holders to work through the hierarchy of controls. So this is a mandatory part of it. So first of all, you've got a hazard. And again, if we use the hazard of broken glass, it seems to be what I'm using today. The way that we can eliminate that is by removing it from the area. So nobody has exposure to broken glass throughout the day. So that's removing a hazard. So eliminate a hazard if you can. But it's not always reasonably practicable to eliminate hazards, okay? So driving is a hazard, for example. But if you need to drive or get A to B as part of your job, you can't eliminate that. So let's say we can't eliminate a hazard. We would then do one of these 3. So we would substitute the hazard with a safer alternative, isolate the hazard from people, or reduce the risk through engineering controls. An example of substitution is if we had a corrosive chemical that we were using, and then we decide to replace it with alcohol 70%. So you're still using a chemical, but you've gone from a very corrosive chemical to a much safer alternative. To isolate the hazard from people, physical barriers to ensure that people can't go there. If you're working on electricity, turning the electricity off, or water, turning the water off, and reduce the risk through engineering controls. Really good example of engineering controls are, if you work in an office, having your power cords close to your desk is a great idea, and that's an engineering control because that has been put there to make it easier. If I've got a desk here and the power points are way behind me, I'm going to end up with cords running along the ground and some trip hazards there. So let's say you can't do any of those three. You then move down to reduce the exposure to the hazard using admin controls. So admin controls can be lockout, tag out, signage, training, just telling people, hey, be careful, there's a trip hazard over there. These are all admin controls. And then finally, you've got PPE. And PPE is personal protective equipment, so masks, safety glasses, safety shoes, high vis, chemical PPE, that's all examples of PPE. So can you see how the higher up you go, the more effective a control measure will be? And this is what you must go through for each hazard that you have in the workplace. So it's not always reasonably practical to eliminate risks. So that's why we've got the hierarchy of controls. And you can use a combination. You might have PPE in place as well as some administrative controls, so they can work together. But that's the hierarchy of controls, and this needs to be a part of your risk assessment. When it comes to developing and implementing control measures, there are a lot of resources out there to help you. So codes of practice is a big one. So on the left-hand side here, I've got all the examples of the codes that you can access off Safe Work Australia's website, and they're free to access. And I'll be sending a copy of the code that I'm referencing today to everybody as well. There's also manufacturing and suppliers of plant substances or equipment. They might have their own guidance materials that they give you if you purchase something, and industry associations and unions as well may be able to provide some information. Guidance materials here, the two examples I've given, one is for guidance materials for safe design, manufacture, import and supplying of plant, and then traffic management. So if you're ever doing something to do with traffic management, you can jump onto Safe Work Australia and here's a resource or information sheet that you can grab if it's relevant to the risk assessment that you're doing. So they're really good. I suggest that you read through any of them that are relevant to your industry sector. So on step 4, when is a review required? So when the control measure is not effective in controlling the risk, before a change at the workplace that is likely to give rise to a new or different health and safety risk that the control measure may not effectively control. If a new hazard or risk has been identified, if the results of consultation indicate that a review is necessary, and if health and safety representatives require a review. So that's only if you've got HSRs. Can be same with a safety committee member as well if you've got one in your industry. So these are when reviews are required. So you really need to ensure you've identified your hazard, you've assessed your risk, you've put controls in place, but you need to actually review those controls to ensure that they are effective, because you may have implemented if you're on your phone while you're working and you're driving a lot, maybe they've implemented a procedure that you can't drive while you're on the phone, even if it's hands-free. That might be something that your company's bought in. And then they need to do a review. So after a couple of weeks, is this practical? Is this practical for the business? Is this practical for the workers? So that review is really, really important. Because if it's not, we need to be versatile. We need to take on the feedback that we're getting from the workers or stakeholders, and we need to change. Also, what I'll be sending you, if you don't already have a risk register, here's a really simple template that you can use as a business. And I can help you come up with a risk register as well if you need it. This one's off the code of practice. I'll send the codes. I'll send this template to you as well. But basically, whenever you perform a risk assessment, it's not a one-off job. It's like a consistent hazard within the workplace. It needs to be going into your risk register. So this example here, you've got your location and date. That's pretty simple. Your hazard. So you put your hazard there, and then you're answering what is the harm that could potentially happen. So that's your consequence. What is the likelihood? You add that in there, and then what is the risk? So if we go back to that risk matrix, you might go, your consequences are 2, your likelihoods are 3, you do your times tables and you put that in there. How effective are the current controls, and what further controls are required? So a good example of that is that office example. So if a PowerPoint wasn't close to my desk, I either need to move my desk closer to the PowerPoint or move the PowerPoint, right? But we can't do that instantly. You can't just magically put a PowerPoint there. So we need to call an electrician. You know, they might take a month to actually get here and do it. So that would be a future control. But we still need a short-term control. So maybe we'll put some signs up, or we'll put some hazard tape over the top, or we'll use those excellent devices where you can just, you know, stick it over the carpet so people can't trip on it anymore. So we've got those short and long-term aspects of it as well. Action by is really important. If a hazard hasn't got an owner, it's probably not going to be reviewed. So if you're a big business and you've got different sections, or there's a Burnie branch, there's a Hobart branch, you could split it up into action owners. You want a due date to keep yourself accountable, and the date that you've completed it. And that review piece is right at the end. So that's really important. And we've gone through why that is really important for businesses. So that's a lot of information that I've just given you, and it's pretty high level. So it's straight out of the codes. It's general. It's a foundation that the business needs to work for. If you need any help with it, if you haven't implemented a risk management process, or you haven't got a procedure, or you have and you want me to have a look at it, I'm more than happy to. And because my role is funded by WorkCover, it's free in most instances. So I can come to your site and have a look, do a risk assessment with you if you need me to. We can look through the management systems that you've got in place. And if you're looking to implement risk assessments, if you haven't already, we've got heaps of training materials as well. So I can come to any site in Tasmania and perform training that's needed as well in those cases. So I will send out an email to everybody that's attended with my information. So if anyone needs to contact me regarding any of this, please do so. I will now open up for any questions.